Luffy could not have beaten Kaido in a fair 1v1 in Wano. We all know that. It took a team effort, in fact multiple team efforts, before Luffy was able to finish things off. However, that's not the same question as whether or not Luffy could beat Kaido 1v1 today, as Luffy today would be starting out with all of the power-ups that he earned over Onigashima. I've seen too many readers try and diminish Luffy's victory in Onigashima by focusing on the outside circumstances that helped him get the win, acting as though it was a fluke, or even that Luffy isn't truly quote-unquote Yonko level just yet. But what readers don't take into account is that even though Luffy as he was at the start of the battle obviously had no hope of defeating Kaido, that doesn't change the fact that Luffy, at the end of the fight, once he had achieved Advanced Conqueror's Haki and Gear 5th, was an entirely different person. If this Luffy, completely fresh, were to fight Kaido, completely fresh, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that Luffy would come out the winner. There are 4 major arguments that people make to say that Kaido was still stronger than Luffy at the end of Wano. 1. Luffy had a lot of help and Kaido did not. 2. Luffy defeated a heavily injured Kaido. 3. Kaido was also using his flames to keep Onigashima up. And 4. Kaido did not need to take the Bajarang gun attack. There is a problem with each of these 4 arguments that I will explain one by one, and by the end, you may believe that Luffy did in fact already surpass Kaido at the end of Wano. But before we get into it, I wanted to ask, are you all using the internet safely? Because if you're not encrypting your personal information, big companies or cyber criminals can steal it. Luckily, you can easily protect yourself with Surfshark VPN, the sponsor for this video. With Surfshark on, I know that I'm browsing online in complete stealth mode. No one is tracking me, I'm like a ghost. Even Surfshark itself has no idea what I'm doing online. And the best part is that with Surfshark VPN, I can change my location to anywhere on the globe. Think of how many times you've seen some streaming service that says, this show or movie is not available in your country. With Surfshark, you can get access to that right away. Even if you're a fan of international sports like football or tennis, you can also get access to free streams easily by just switching your location to another country. There is pretty much no reason for me not to use a VPN when I'm online, since I get complete privacy and security, and I also get to just travel around the globe like it's nothing. So if you've been wanting to try a VPN, you can get 3 extra months free right now by hitting the link below and using code MORGE. The best part is there is absolutely no risk since you get a 30-day money-back guarantee. Just hit the link below and use code MORGE for 83% off and 3 extra months free. So that aside, to begin with, before getting into readers' arguments in favor of Kaido, I think there is a general subconscious bias among readers to always want to see Luffy as the underdog. It feels almost wrong to think that Luffy is so quickly passing up legendary pirates that have ruled the seas for decades like Kaido and Big Mom, especially considering that Kaido was referred to as the world's strongest creature so often. I think the natural instinct of readers is to be skeptical of the idea that Luffy has actually surpassed Kaido so quickly. However, to that I will say, it should be fairly clear at this point in the story that there are now much bigger fish to fry than Kaido. Luffy passing up Kaido doesn't mean that Luffy's reached the ceiling too fast. As Kaido himself explains, there are still levels to all of this that are yet to be seen. And with recent chapters, just getting to see a glimpse of what a true legend like Garp must have been capable of in his prime, or what current Shanks can do today, makes it clear that there are crazy levels to Haki beyond what Luffy or Kaido were doing during their fight, and that's before even getting to the potential endgame godlike opponents. So let's just put things in perspective here. Just because Luffy surpassing Kaido seemed crazy back in chapter 795, that has no bearing on today. At this point, it's becoming more and more clear that Kaido was never the ceiling in the first place. And Kaido himself is well aware of this. So with that in mind, the first actual argument against Luffy surpassing Kaido that you regularly see is, why did Oda have so many people help Luffy? Well, that's because what Luffy needed at the start of that Onigashima battle is not necessarily the same thing that he would need today. Luffy at his starting level at the rooftop fight was obviously nowhere near Kaido yet, so Oda obviously needed to initially give Luffy some buffers throughout that fight so that Luffy would have opportunities to grow, or else Luffy would get crushed by Kaido too early. That's why it was naturally necessary for a ton of outside factors to be written in initially, so that Luffy wasn't just fighting Kaido by himself from the start. Luffy needed time to catch up to Kaido's level. Remember, the question is not, did Luffy beat Kaido without any help? The question is whether Luffy by the end of the fight had become strong enough with Advanced Conqueror's Haki and Gear 5th that he would win 1v1 in a hypothetical rematch if it happened today. After all, once Luffy got his power-ups, everyone else cleared out so that Luffy fought Kaido 1v1 for the rest of the arc, and Luffy did ultimately defeat Kaido once he achieved Gear 5th. Now here you might say, hold on Morge, you know that's not fair, that prior team effort still matters because by the time it was a 1v1, Kaido was heavily injured. And this is the second argument. The prior team efforts caused damage to Kaido, Kaido's health was low, making it easier for Luffy to fight Kaido 1v1. That's true. However, what people don't mention is that Luffy's health was also extremely low by the time he got his final power-up, Gear 5th. In fact, at that point, Luffy's health was clearly even lower than Kaido's health. Remember, thanks to outside interference, Luffy was actually caught by a literal lethal blow from Kaido. Luffy technically died, or was at the very least proclaimed dead. There is no way to argue this. If Luffy is literally being declared dead, then his health is lower than Kaido's at this point. However damaged Kaido is, it's not as much as Luffy is, because Luffy's health bar literally hit 0. You cannot be more damaged than Luffy was at this point. That's kind of what death means. Meaning that at the point that Luffy got his final power-up, Gear 5th, Luffy had sustained, at this point, greater damage than Kaido. Yes, Kaido was very injured at this point, but Luffy was very literally dancing on the borderline between life and death. Now you might be saying, but Morge, a lot of Kaido's injuries were caused by other characters, the prior team efforts, whereas almost all of Luffy's injuries were caused by Kaido himself. That's 100% true, but for what we're talking about, how the characters got the injuries isn't relevant at this point, because again, the question is not, did Luffy successfully defeat Kaido 1v1? The question is, in a rematch today, could Gear 5th Luffy defeat Kaido 1v1? As such, the only thing that's really relevant is how healthy each character was when the Gear 5th round began, as that's the point that Luffy had his full abilities that he would be fighting with today in a rematch from the start. So if we want to guess at how Gear 5th Luffy would do against Kaido today, we just have to look at what happened when Gear 5th Luffy fought Kaido at Onigashima and take into account how injured each of them were at the start of that specific section of the fight. It doesn't really matter how the two characters got injured beforehand, we just need to know how low each of their health was at the point that Luffy started using Gear 5th. And in this case, Kaido's health was actually undeniably higher than Luffy's when the Gear 5th round began. Because again, while Kaido was injured, Luffy was factually, indisputably at an even lower point in health, as Luffy's health had literally just hit 0. When Luffy is fighting Kaido in Gear 5th, he is, right now, more injured than Kaido. That is in fact reiterated multiple times over the course of Gear 5th Luffy vs Kaido by both combatants, that while Kaido is tired, Luffy is fighting while basically half dead. Luffy is in the worst condition, Luffy is the one who might die at literally any moment. He's just pushing through all that for the sake of winning the fight, as Luffy tends to always do in final battles. So looking at the question of what would happen if Gear 5th Luffy had a rematch with Kaido today with both of them healthy, well, Gear 5th Luffy already defeated Kaido when both of them were injured, and if anything, Gear 5th Luffy was actually more injured in that scenario. Now, the next major argument I see people bring up is that, well, Kaido was weakened the entire time because he was also holding Onigashima up with his flames. That's a strange argument to me, as it's not really based on anything. I viewed the flames as just a necessary plot device to move Onigashima along, as the flames are never implied to be lowering Kaido's strength or having any impact on the fight. However, if you want to argue that, well, the flames must be using up Kaido's strength because they just have to be, I would say that the little evidence that we have on this matter actually points to the contrary. To begin with, the closest similar example we have to Kaido using his flames to hold up Onigashima is Doflamingo using the birdcage in Dressrosa. In Dressrosa, it seems pretty clear that the birdcage is not using up Doflamingo's strength, it's just a passive ability. I say this is clear because we actually get to see Doflamingo in an identical fight, both with and without the birdcage up. Doflamingo fights Law once before the birdcage, and he fights Law again during the birdcage, and the fights play out pretty much exactly the same way, with Law giving Doflamingo a bit of a challenge both times, but being ultimately outmatched. There is literally no evidence that Doflamingo is somehow weaker during his second fight against Law with the birdcage up than in his first fight without the birdcage. Law does arguably do marginally better in the second fight, but Doflamingo was also injured from the start by Luffy, so all in all there's not really any notable difference between Doflamingo fighting with the birdcage versus without the birdcage. Now, if you want to make the claim that, hey, Kaido's flames on Onigashima are just totally different from Doflamingo's birdcage, and the flames must have been draining Kaido's strength just because, well, they must have been, well, luckily at the most important part of the Luffy versus Kaido fight, Kaido actually did not have his flames up. That's right, people forget, but at the climactic moment, the clash between Luffy and Kaido's most powerful attacks, Raizo's water, actually put out the flames. That's why Momonosuke had his moment of catching Onigashima and moving it, before Luffy defeated Kaido. It was only after that that Luffy won the clash. At the end of the day, there is no flames excuse for Kaido, since the flames weren't even up during the final clash. Luffy's attack was just stronger than Kaido's, plain and simple. This moment also strongly suggests that the flames weren't using up Kaido's strength throughout the fight before this either. Because if you really think that the flames were draining Kaido's strength this entire time, well then, shouldn't Kaido have gained a big burst of strength the moment that his flames disappeared? I mean, if it's been such a burden for him, holding up the island all this time, then when he and Luffy are having their clash and suddenly the flames go out and Kaido's supposed handicap is suddenly removed, then shouldn't that be like taking off some heavy weights for him? Shouldn't Kaido immediately win this clash? I mean, think about it. If Luffy and Kaido were in a dead equal struggle when the flames were on, and the flames are supposedly holding Kaido back, then shouldn't Kaido immediately win the struggle the moment that the flames go out? It literally makes zero sense for Luffy to actually be the one to overpower Kaido after the flames go out, unless the flames were never a handicap to Kaido in the first place. So bottom line, it's never been implied that the flames were having any effect on the battle, and the one moment of evidence that we do have, in fact, strongly suggests that they had no effect. And finally, we come to the argument that Kaido only tried to block Bajarang gun because he is stupid. The argument is that Kaido was winning against Gear 5th Luffy prior to Bajarang gun, and if Kaido was smart, he could have just stayed in his hybrid form, dodged that big attack, and then gone back to beating up Luffy, instead of transforming into a giant flaming dragon and trying to take Luffy's attack head on. Here's the thing. I think people forget how that scenario actually played out. If you look back at the Gear 5th section of the fight, for the first several chapters, Luffy has the upper hand. It's only in the one chapter right before the clash that Kaido finally begins to adjust and gains the upper hand back. So this is where people say that Kaido only lost because he stupidly decided to take the Bajarang gun head on, right? Well, what people forget is that Luffy did actually catch Kaido first. Luffy caught Kaido before then pulling out the Bajarang gun as the finisher. Luffy didn't just use Bajarang gun as a big slow move that he was lucky Kaido decided to tank. Luffy's plan was to catch Kaido and then hit him with his strongest attack, which Luffy was clearly set up to do. And to be clear, we were factually shown that Kaido was caught and could not get out. You can call it dumb writing, but it's still what happened. We were shown Kaido did try everything, from physical attacks, to wind attacks, to Boro breath, and Luffy would simply not let go. Nothing Kaido did worked. You can go reread the chapter if you like, but the fact is, Luffy did actually catch Kaido, and Luffy had him right where he wanted him to hit him with the Bajarang gun, which is an island-sized attack, and Kaido very literally could not escape. The only reason Kaido actually finally got Luffy to let him go was because Kaido decided to put all his chips on the table himself and transform into his giant flame dragon mode. That was finally enough to make Luffy release him. But it's not like Kaido could have escaped without using the flame dragon mode, as we saw that Kaido tried to and failed. So this is the biggest misconception I see, that people think Kaido could have just stayed in hybrid form and dodged Bajarang gun, and Kaido only went into Flame Dragon mode out of honor to take Luffy head on. The reality is that while the honor aspect is partly true, it's also true that Kaido actually had no way of escaping the Bajarang gun until he resorted to the Flame Dragon mode. So the Flame Dragon and Bajarang gun clash was going to happen no matter how you dice it, and Luffy wins that clash. So looking back at all the arguments, did Luffy have a lot of help and teamwork? Yes, but that stopped being necessary once Luffy got his Advanced Conqueror's Haki and Gear 5th power-ups, which is what matters for a rematch today. Was Kaido heavily injured? Yes, but Luffy was even more injured by the point that he attained Gear 5th, meaning Gear 5th Luffy beat Kaido despite being more injured than Kaido. Was Kaido handicapped because he was using flames to hold up Onigashima? There is no evidence to suggest that the flames were anything more than a passive ability that was a necessary plot device, and what little evidence we do have suggests that it did not affect Kaido's strength at all. Was Kaido kicking Gear 5th Luffy's ass and only lost because he took Bajarang gun head on for no reason? No, Kaido was actually caught and right where Luffy wanted him to hit him with Bajarang gun. Kaido had to use Flame Dragon mode to release himself, meaning that the giant clash of attacks was going to happen no matter what. Now, all that being said, does that mean that a fresh Gear 5th Luffy would beat Kaido today? Well, there is one huge caveat that makes me hesitant to say yes. While I think Gear 5th Luffy is stronger than Kaido, and that Luffy demonstrated that in the Wano arc, I don't know if Luffy can actually keep Gear 5th going long enough to beat Kaido. Kaido, over the course of Onigashima, showed a ridiculous amount of stamina. He lasted basically an entire night of fighting against some of the strongest fighters in the New World, and the problem with Gear 5th Luffy right now is that it doesn't seem like he can hold that form for that long. So while Luffy and Kaido were both in extremely low health for the Gear 5th round of their Onigashima battle, that at least meant that Luffy didn't actually need to use Gear 5th for that long to defeat Kaido. If they were both completely fresh, then Kaido may simply be able to outlast Luffy till Luffy runs out of Gear 5th. So the stamina point is the only reason I think Luffy might not have passed up Kaido overall, even if I do believe that in Gear 5th, Luffy is stronger than Kaido. Now, this was the first time I've ever gone so in-depth on a power scaling topic for a video, so whether or not you agreed, I hope you enjoy the rare change of pace ahead of the upcoming epic anime adaptation of this battle. Ultimately, I think Luffy vs Kaido is much closer than many readers believe, and there is a strong argument that Luffy at his peak is stronger than Kaido. But let me know in the comments below who you think would win a rematch today, and if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like and subscribe. And you can get my additional thoughts on a broader pattern that I see developing for Luffy's fights in the New World on my exclusive podcast by supporting me on Patreon. Just hit the link in the description below.